Helen White was born on February 14, 1993, in a small town near Chicago, Illinois. Her childhood was far from perfect. Her parents divorced when she was only 6 years old. Her mother, a nurse by profession, worked night shifts and often left Helen in the care of neighbors or her older cousin. Helen grew up in an emotionally unstable environment, forced to become independent far too early. This upbringing made her tough, but it also instilled a deep insecurity, which she spent her life trying to hide behind a successful career. At 25, Helen moved to a big city and began working as a real estate agent. Within a few years, she quickly climbed the career ladder and earned a reputation as an ambitious and successful professional. On the surface, her life seemed perfect. A high-paying job, prestigious clients, and regular trips to conferences and seminars. But beneath the surface of her success lay deep dissatisfaction and loneliness. Helen wasn't lonely because she lacked male attention, but because her internal desires never aligned with her real life. Since childhood, Helen had been drawn to men who were already in relationships. This feeling, which she barely understood herself, symbolized power for her, a way to take from others what she had always been deprived of: stability, love, and recognition. She never saw her actions as morally wrong. On the contrary, it was her way of asserting herself and compensating for years of neglect and humiliation in her childhood. One of the most striking examples of her obsession began in June 2022, when Helen met her cousin's husband, Mark Clark. Helen never felt genuine love for Mark. She was driven by a sense of triumph over Fiona, who had always been the center of attention at family gatherings. Mark embodied what Helen had always wanted: a stable, strong man who could protect and provide. But he wasn't just an object of her desire. He was also a tool to destroy Fiona's life, whom Helen had secretly resented since childhood. Fiona Clark was born on November 12, 1990, into a wealthy family in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts. Unlike Helen, her childhood was relatively happy. She grew up in a supportive family, surrounded by the love and attention of her parents. Fiona was always perfect in everything she did: academics, sports, and social life. When Helen and Fiona met at family events, the contrast between them was evident, and this had angered Helen from an early age. Fiona married Mark Clark in 2015. He had served in the military, and their lives were often filled with relocations. After retiring from the service, Mark got a job at a private security firm, and he and Fiona settled in a large city on the east coast of the U.S. Their life seemed flawless. They bought a cozy home, raised 2 children, and were surrounded by many friends. But behind the facade of prosperity, problems were brewing. Mark, after returning from military service, suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though he tried to keep it hidden. He was often tormented by nightmares, and he gradually became more withdrawn. Fiona noticed this, but tried not to dwell on his silence, focusing on her work at an IT company. They were drifting apart, even though both were trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy. These cracks in their marriage created fertile ground for Helen to make her move. Initially, their interactions were quite friendly. Helen frequently visited their home and spent time with the kids, pretending to be a caring aunt. She always found a way to be around, especially during times when Fiona was preoccupied with work. Helen started noticing the smallest discontent in Mark, catching moments when he seemed down, and she expertly manipulated his mood, playing on his vulnerabilities. Fiona had no idea about her cousin's hidden motives and continued to believe that Helen was just a lonely relative in need of support. By September 2022, Mark and Helen had begun exchanging secret messages, and their relationship gradually developed into an emotional dependency, which soon evolved into something far more dangerous. It all started in July 2022 when Helen, seizing an opportunity while Fiona was busy with work, offered to help Mark with the kids. She began visiting her cousin's home more frequently, claiming she just wanted to assist the family. At first, it was small favors, babysitting the children while Mark took them to their activities, preparing dinner, or tidying up the house. Mark, absorbed in work and household responsibilities, was grateful for Helen's help, not realizing that she was slowly infiltrating his personal life. Helen acted cautiously. Her plan wasn't straightforward. She didn't attempt to seduce Mark right away. Instead, she skillfully manipulated his emotions, creating the illusion that only she truly understood him. She was there when he was battling his internal demons related to PTSD. Helen played the role of someone who could offer Mark the emotional support he couldn't find in his marriage to Fiona. By September 2022, their conversations had shifted to more personal topics. They started discussing not only the children and daily concerns, but also their deeper feelings, fears, and disappointments. By October, Mark began to notice how his relationship with Helen was becoming more intimate. Their private conversations became regular. They would text each other late at night when Fiona was asleep, or exchange secret messages during the day when Helen happened to be near his office. Helen played the part of a vulnerable woman who supposedly needed male attention and protection. She confided in Mark about how hard it was living alone without a reliable man by her side, and how she envied Fiona for having such a strong marriage. This manipulative approach soon started to work on Mark. He began to see Helen as the one who understood him. Gradually, their friendly hugs turned into lingering touches, and just looking at her face began to stir feelings of guilt within him. But despite this, he couldn't pull away from her. In November 2022, Helen took it a step further. She suggested that Mark meet her at a cafe outside of their usual social circle. Mark agreed. During this meeting, Helen drew even more of his attention by opening up emotionally and positioning herself as vulnerable. She told him how she had always felt lonely in this world and hinted that her attraction to him was more than just gratitude for his friendship. After that, their relationship entered a new phase. By mid-November, they began meeting in secret at hotels and vacant homes that Helen was showing as a real estate agent. Their affair became physical, and each new secret they kept from Fiona only deepened their emotional connection. For Helen, this was a game of power. She reveled in the fact that she could not only control Mark, but also systematically dismantle her cousin's marriage. Fiona, still unaware, continued living her ordinary life. But by December 2022, her intuition began telling her that something was wrong. Mark was increasingly going to work meetings and coming home irritable and distant. Fiona noticed that he had become more secretive. His phone was always by his side, and he made sure not to leave it unattended. When Fiona asked him what was bothering him, Mark would give vague answers or avoid the conversation altogether. In January 2023, Fiona began to notice Mark's cold stares and how he was spending less time with the kids. It made her start to question things, but she didn't yet have any concrete proof of an affair. Amid this tension in their marriage, Mark became increasingly reliant on Helen, whose manipulation only continued to intensify. By early February 2023, Fiona's suspicions had grown beyond mere gut feelings. Mark was disappearing more frequently without explanation, and his behavior was becoming increasingly distant. One day, Fiona noticed that Mark had changed the password on his phone, something that was unusual for him. This heightened her anxiety and pushed her to take action. On February 10, 2023, Fiona reached out to a private investigator recommended by a colleague. His task was to find out where Mark was spending his time and with whom. The detective quickly got to work and began surveilling Mark. Fiona was shocked when, after just a week, she received the first results. Photos of her husband with Helen in various secluded locations around the city. They had been meeting in small cafes out of town, and one day the investigator tracked them to a hotel located on the city's outskirts. By February 17, 2023, Fiona had the undeniable proof. Photos showing that Mark and Helen were clearly more than just friends. These were irrefutable pieces of evidence. For Fiona, it felt like a punch to the gut. She experienced a wave of anger and pain, but instead of lashing out and causing a scene, she made a cold and calculated decision to exact her revenge. Over the next few days, Fiona planned her retaliation. She invited Mark and Helen to spend a weekend at a rented house by the lake, a place they had discussed before for a relaxing getaway. Helen, believing that it was simply Fiona's way of regaining control over the situation and restoring harmony in their relationship, accepted the invitation without the slightest suspicion. Mark also agreed to go, although he felt a bit uneasy. However, his anxiety was quelled by the belief that Fiona didn't know anything. By February 25, 2023, the house by the lake was ready for their arrival. Everything appeared to be an innocent attempt by Fiona to reconnect with her husband and cousin. She carefully created an atmosphere of warmth and relaxation, but beneath it all lay her true intention: to confront them with their betrayal and watch their reaction. On the evening of February 26, during dinner, Fiona suddenly laid all her cards on the table. She started calmly asking Mark about his recent work meetings and business trips. The tension mounted, and when Mark began to dodge the questions, Fiona pulled out an envelope of photos and threw it onto the table. Helen turned pale and Mark froze in place, realizing that their secret was out. Fiona coolly explained how long she had known about the affair and the steps she had taken to gather evidence. Mark was stunned but tried to justify himself, claiming that it had been a difficult time in their relationship and that he never meant to hurt her. Helen, in shock, stammered as she attempted to defend herself, but her words were drowned out by the rising intensity of the atmosphere. An argument erupted between Mark and Helen. They began accusing each other of allowing the affair to happen, further escalating the situation. Soon the tension around the dinner table became unbearable, and Fiona, who had managed to keep her composure until that moment, finally let her emotions take over. That evening, February 26, 2023, the situation reached its breaking point. After Fiona exposed the affair, the tension during dinner escalated into an open confrontation. Mark tried to calm both women, but their emotions were already running wild. Helen defended herself, blaming Mark for pushing her into the affair, while Fiona's anger only grew deeper. At one point, the argument reached its peak. Fiona abruptly left the dining room and headed to her car. A few minutes later, she returned, holding a gun she had secretly brought from home. It was a small revolver that had belonged to her father, a hunter. She had always kept it as a symbol of protection, but at that moment, she intended to use it to intimidate. Shaking with rage, Fiona pointed the weapon at Helen, threatening her for the betrayal. She didn't plan to shoot, but her nerves were on edge. Realizing the real danger, Mark rushed toward Fiona to disarm her. That's when everything went wrong. In the chaos, as Mark grabbed Fiona's arm, a struggle ensued. The gun went off and the bullet struck Mark in the chest. For a few seconds, time seemed to slow down. Mark, stunned and in shock, clutched his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. But soon he began to collapse. His eyes clouded over, and in a moment he fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Blood quickly spread across the floor. Helen screamed as she watched the life drain out of Mark. Fiona stood frozen, still holding the gun, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was at that moment that both women realized their lives had changed forever. Mark's death had not been part of the plan. Fiona hadn't intended to kill him. She only wanted to make him and Helen confront the depth of their betrayal. But now Mark was dead, and nothing could bring him back. Shock quickly turned to panic. Helen, barely managing to control her terror, suggested they cover up what had happened. Both she and Fiona knew that the police would likely view the incident as premeditated murder, and they would both end up in prison. Helen proposed they create a story claiming that Mark had died in a hunting accident. Since the house was located in a remote area with no neighbors to witness anything, the plan seemed plausible. They acted quickly. Early in the morning of February 27th, the women took Mark's body to the lake nearby and threw the gun into the water. Helen crafted the details of a false alibi, including the timing and circumstances of the supposed hunting accident. While Fiona was in a state of complete emotional devastation, Helen took charge, carefully orchestrating the plan to cover their tracks. However, the plan was doomed from the start. Though their story initially seemed believable, investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. After Fiona called the police to report the accident, the investigation began. Officers arrived at the scene and asked several questions that made both women nervous. Fiona couldn't keep her emotions in check. She nervously stumbled over details, repeating the same story about how Mark had gone hunting with the gun and accidentally shot himself. But the investigators, noticing her shaky demeanor, suspected something was off. They began to see that parts of the story from both women didn't add up. On the morning of February 28, 2023, police returned to the scene after Fiona's distressing call. Her story that Mark had died in a hunting accident initially didn't raise suspicions with the investigators. Helen and Fiona appeared shaken and grief-stricken, and at first glance, everything seemed to fit. The police began a standard investigation, but their experience told them that something in this story just didn't seem right. The first red flag was Fiona's behavior. Investigators noticed her nervousness and the inconsistencies in her account of the incident. Fiona kept getting confused about how exactly the shooting occurred, And when asked about the sequence of events, she changed her story several times. In contrast, Helen remained cold and composed, sticking to a single version of events, that it was a hunting accident. However, the lack of physical evidence supporting a hunting scenario, along with the cleanliness of Mark's clothing, raised doubts among the investigators. On March 1, 2023, investigators returned to the scene where, according to the women, the accident had taken place. They thoroughly examined the area by the lake, where Fiona claimed Mark had accidentally shot himself. However, there were no signs of a struggle on the ground, and the way Mark's body was positioned didn't match the described events. Additionally, the police couldn't locate the gun, further deepening their suspicions. By March 3, 2023, investigators began questioning neighbors and the owners of the rented house to corroborate Helen and Fiona's story. It turned out that several witnesses had heard screams coming from the house the day before Mark was found dead. This confirmed suspicions that Mark's death was the result of internal conflict rather than a hunting accident. On March 4, 2023, the police called Helen and Fiona back in for further questioning. This time, they were separated to get more detailed statements. Fiona, who had been in emotional shock since the tragedy, became increasingly agitated. Under pressure from the investigators, she admitted that Mark had died during a struggle but insisted it was an accident. However, the investigators weren't satisfied with this explanation. They continued to press Fiona, slowly breaking down her defense. Realizing that her lies were about to be exposed, Fiona cracked under pressure on March 5, 2023. She confessed that she had indeed pulled the gun in a fit of rage, but claimed she never intended to shoot Mark. She described the struggle that led to the accidental discharge, but this still didn't explain why they decided to hide his death and dispose of the weapon. Helen, meanwhile, held out for as long as she could, denying her role in the killing. But when investigators informed her that Fiona had begun to confess, Helen started to falter in her story. Under pressure, she also admitted that she and Fiona had thrown the gun into the lake, hoping to cover up the truth. But she continued to insist that it was an accident and that both of them had been overcome by panic after Mark's death. On March 6, 2023, investigators organized a search for the gun in the lake. The weapon was soon recovered, and ballistic tests confirmed that it was the gun used to shoot Mark. That same day, Fiona and Helen were arrested for concealing evidence and providing false statements. By March 8, 2023, investigators concluded the case and prepared it for trial. Helen's obsession and manipulation had led to a tragedy that destroyed 3 lives. Mark was dead, Fiona faced justice for her actions, and Helen, the mastermind behind the entire drama, realized that her desire for control and the destruction of other people's relationships had fatal consequences. The trial for Mark Clark's murder began on June 1, 2023. Fiona and Helen were charged with covering up the murder and obstructing the investigation, though the central issue in court was whether Mark's death was the result of intentional murder or a tragic accident. The case drew significant media attention as the story unfolded into a dark mix of betrayal, obsession, and murder among close relatives. The prosecution presented strong evidence that Fiona had grabbed the gun in a fit of rage, and although she claimed she never intended to shoot Mark, the prosecutors argued that her actions were the result of uncontrollable anger and a deliberate intent to cause harm. Helen, on the other hand, was charged with actively concealing evidence and fabricating a false alibi, which only worsened her situation. The defense argued that Mark's death was a tragic accident caused by the struggle over the gun. Fiona's attorneys tried to show that she acted in a state of emotional shock and was unable to control her actions. Helen's lawyers claimed that she was simply scared and helped to cover up the truth out of panic, but had not played an active role in the murder itself. A surprising twist came on June 14, 2023, when the defense called a witness who turned the entire case upside down. A former colleague of Mark's, his fellow security guard John Harper, testified that a month before his death, Mark had confided in him about problems in his marriage and mentioned that he planned to leave Fiona, and not just for Helen. Harper claimed that Mark was planning to file for divorce and move to another state, where another woman, unknown to anyone else, was waiting for him. This revelation shocked both sides. The prosecution and defense were caught off guard by this new fact about Mark's personal life. For the first time in the trial, Helen looked broken after learning about the existence of another woman. During further questioning, it was revealed that Mark had indeed been planning to leave and had kept this hidden from both women. This revelation gave the case a new direction. Prosecutors used it as evidence that both Helen and Fiona were involved in the conflict with Mark, knowing about his intentions. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, argued that it only supported the theory that the affair triggered an uncontrollable emotional breakdown, with which neither Fiona nor Helen could cope. On June 25, 2023, the trial came to a close. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, they returned a verdict. Fiona was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, taking into account her emotional state at the time of the crime. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. Helen was found guilty of concealing evidence and fabricating a false alibi, as well as aiding in the crime. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years. Despite the verdict, neither woman was able to fully recover from what had happened. Helen's obsession and her desire to destroy Fiona's life, along with Fiona's inner turmoil over trying to save her family, led to a tragedy that forever changed their lives. The trial was merely the official conclusion of the drama, but the scars from this crime would remain with everyone involved for many years